Yes. Speak now.
One totally subjective opinion I have that I feel very strongly about is that art and media preservation is super important work. I think there's a lot to gain from it. Preserving primary sources of the past is historically valuable. They can teach us what things used to be like. Preservation also keeps art in circulation. Art is meant to be appreciated, and a decent preservation effort can allow countless more people to appreciate a work of art over countless more years. And that's not just great for the public, it's great for the artist too. It's nice to think that preservation gives artists a little bit of immortality, keeping some part of their experience on Earth alive for way past a human lifespan. Just a way to say thank you for doing the oftentimes hard, thankless work of making the art that we enjoy. I think there's a lot of inherent goodness in art preservation, and that absolutely includes video game preservation, especially speaking as a big dumb gamer myself. I try to stay optimistic about the future of video game preservation. I mean, humans have a rich history of preserving culturally important art. Ever since some guys in ancient Assyria decided to put all their clay tablets in a room and call it a library, we've been making archives of our culture. And it definitely feels like a lot of the gaming world has been bitten by the art preservation bug. There have been some impressive efforts to create archives of gaming history. Unfortunately, for the moment, asking society to make a serious effort to preserve video games is kind of a hard sell. Any type of cultural preservation is going to be expensive and challenging, and what's fun about video game preservation is that video games have a lot of unique characteristics that make preserving them as difficult as possible at every turn. Video games are new, at least compared to most other artistic mediums, having only been publicly available since the 70s. And it makes a lot of sense that they're so recent. Video games are interactive. They require a level of computing power that has only recently become available. And already, we've reached our first problem. Preserving video games is very technologically demanding, in a way that almost no other form of media preservation is. Video games have extremely broad hardware requirements. Some games are Xbox exclusives, some are PlayStation exclusives, PC exclusives, cell phone apps, arcade games, you got your browser games, your ultra-rare hardware. If you want to play White Men Can't Jump for the Atari Jaguar, it's not enough to own the game, you need to own a working Atari Jaguar. Otherwise, you own a Frisbee. This creates an accessibility problem with video game archives. When an old movie or book or TV show is found, it can be converted to digital, uploaded on some website, and enjoyed by people across the world. That's a lot harder to accomplish with video games. You could archive and share video game footage, and don't get me wrong, that's still totally valuable, especially if we're talking about games with linear narratives or gameplay. But for a lot of games, it's kind of a huge bummer. Essentially, you get to watch someone else have fun playing, like you're a little brother waiting for his turn on the Xbox. That can be enjoyable, but it isn't a replacement for actually getting to play the game. And what's the point of game preservation if the games you are preserving are just going to collect dust in some library? One very helpful tool for solving this problem is emulators. Video game emulators are exactly what they sound like. They're a program which can allow you to run software made for one device on a different device, and they've been a huge help in the preservation effort. If you didn't know, the Internet Archive keeps a free library of classic games. Anyone can access any of their games as long as you have internet connection. It is an awesome example of what game preservation can be, and it's only possible using the JavaScript Mess emulator. That being said, as great as emulators are at making aging games a little more timeless, they aren't a solution in and of themselves. If you aren't playing with the original controllers, which is going to be the case for a lot of people using emulators, you're not experiencing the game the way it was intended to be experienced. This isn't a petty complaint. We're talking about an interactive medium. A lot of thought needs to go into making that interactivity fun and satisfying. Changing the controls and gameplay can be just as disruptive as changing the story or setting. This problem can get especially bad when we start talking about non-traditional controllers. Wii Sports would make a terrible PC game. It's only fun because the motion sensing technology on the Wiimote makes it easier to pretend you're actually a professional baseball player, or a golf guy. And I wouldn't even know where to begin when it comes to emulating VR games. Emulators can also be a little legally problematic. Actually, the problem isn't the emulators themselves. Under most circumstances, those are totally legal. The problem is the ROMs, the software needed for an emulator to run a specific game, which in most cases is protected by copyright. And video game companies are totally horny to sick their lawyers on anyone who isn't following the rules. Also, nowadays, video games are usually protected by digital rights management, or DRM, which are technologies that can prevent the unauthorized access of digital copyrighted material. You know, unauthorized access, the kind of access emulators rely on. In much of the world, there are laws which make it illegal to circumvent DRM. In the United States, it was the DMCA that formally criminalized distributing tools that circumvented DRM. The good news is the DMCA allows for some exceptions to this anti-circumvention rule, specifically for the sake of cultural preservation. But there's an ongoing legal battle between archivists and video game companies to determine how generous these exemptions should be. Archivists are trying to broaden the rules and allow academics and libraries access to copyrighted materials under a greater number of circumstances. Game companies have argued against expanding these exemptions, that doing so would damage their profits. And these companies are backed by the Entertainment Software Association, the video game industry's immensely influential trade association. This legal battle leaves the legality of using emulators for preservation in kind of a precarious place. And all that is only the beginning of the struggle. Another problem is that video games are different from most forms of media in that, a lot of the time, the finished product is not really a finished product. It is an increasingly common trend for games to release in an unfinished state and then receive updates through patches, essentially passing the burden of QA testing onto the consumers. Some games release large, regular updates as a deliberate stylistic choice. Some games have DLCs that could probably be standalone games in their own right. The point is, it really complicates the process of media preservation when it's not entirely clear what part of the media should be preserved. Yeah, it's true that video games aren't the only medium in which works are occasionally updated or changed after release. The original Star Wars trilogy was re-released multiple times in the decades following its original run, usually with technical tweaks or updated visual effects. However, Star Wars was still a completed product. The Star Wars you can see on TV today is mostly the same movie as the one your parents saw in theaters way back when, janky hitboxes and all. In gaming, it's not uncommon for a game to be almost unrecognizable just a couple of years after release. Then there are those games where the players are the game, like Battle Royale games or MMORPGs or a lot of mobile games. It doesn't make sense to play these games alone, just like how it doesn't make sense to play volleyball alone. And with these games, not only does the gameplay require other people to enjoy most of its features, they also require maintaining servers for the sake of preservation, which is completely impractical. Archiving a game like this is more like archiving a game's corpse. There's not much left. Another issue with game preservation today has to do with the video game industry's shift away from physical media like game discs or cartridges and towards digital media. So, digital media comes with all sorts of benefits, the biggest one being convenience. You can buy a game at any time, anywhere, without even leaving your couch, and that speaks intimately to the modern consumer's lazy impulses, me included. God knows, I don't want to go back to the days of having to take a trip to Target anytime I want to try a new game. And in an ideal world, the rise of digital media should be a huge boon for preservationists. Digital media is less vulnerable to the wear and tear that comes with being a tangible, fragile piece of technology and can be shared much more easily than physical media. Physical media, however, comes with one crucial advantage. When you own the game, you own the game. With digital games, you get a license to download the game for as long as the studios want to make them available, which can become a problem once titles get old and start disappearing from digital stores. It reminds me of, if you've been following entertainment news at all, you might have heard about a really depressing trend in the streaming world. Streaming services will sometimes pull their original programs off their catalog. Since these programs likely never received any physical release, they totally disappear from legal circulation. The video game industry has a similar problem with their digital products. If a game is exclusively sold through an online store, like the Microsoft Store or the PlayStation Store, they are only available for purchase as long as these stores are selling it. Some months ago, Nintendo shut down their Wii U and 3DS shops. This knocked digital-only games from these consoles completely off the market, including the Virtual Console line of classic games. There's this lopsided arrangement between gamers and game makers where they ask us not to pirate their work, all while making it as difficult as possible to legally access their titles. And beyond what it means for the consumer, it's disturbing how little respect these studios have for the passion and hard work and imagination that goes into developing a video game. To them, the games they produce aren't an expression of creativity, they're a product, like the bubble wrap they use to ship them out. In fact, there's really no way to sidestep the issue that, as I've already touched on, a lot of the roadblocks in video game preservation are deliberately set up by the studios and their parent companies for the sake of squeezing every bit of profit from the market. Their antagonism comes in a lot of forms. Big studios will use their endless legal resources to bend a country's copyright laws to their whims. They will rain hellfire on individuals who try to circumvent their copyright protections. And, of course, they will absolutely create artificial scarcity if it's good for business. On a Q&A post on Nintendo's support website from around the time the Wii U store was shutting down, they directly addressed the consequences their actions would have on game preservation. Their response is plugging the Switch's online subscription service, which allows access to a lot of classic games, and to confirm that they had no plans to release their classic games in any other format. This post was later deleted. I had to find it on the Internet Archive. See? Archiving, it's good stuff. I'm sure whoever wrote that Q&A post got thrown under the bus, but at least it's honest. What we have is a bad case of not my job. Gaming companies exist to make money for their shareholders. They aren't here to preserve our culture, or to educate the future, or any other hippy-dippy bullshit. And as much as this attitude personally drives me crazy, it's true, preserving video games isn't their job. For the time being, until massive video game corporations decide they want to contribute to video game preservation instead of tearing it down, preservationists are just going to have to work around them, which has not been and will not be easy. It's one thing when the obstacles you're facing are technological. Any new technology is going to have growing pains. When TV began, preserving any program was completely impractical. But as technology developed, that stopped being the case. So I find it way easier to be optimistic about the technological issues that preservationists face. But when the obstacle is human, when it's companies that humans build and institutions that humans create, shit starts to feel a lot more daunting. If there's one thing powerful people do love to preserve, it's their power. So going up against Nintendo or Microsoft or Sony or any of the rest of them basically feels like you're going up against the decades and centuries it took for these organizations to amass their power. It's David and Goliath, except this Goliath has $100 billion, and all he wants to do is repeatedly punch David in the balls. So, unfortunately, video game preservation is kind of a nightmare. It's a nightmare in all the ways every other type of historic preservation is, plus some other stuff. And to be honest, I understand why some people might not think it's worth the effort. Preservation is a game of chicken with time itself. Cultures appear and disappear, that's what they do. And so much of video game history has been lost already. A study conducted by the Video Game History Foundation determined that only 13% of video game history is still accessible by the public. According to David Gibson, an archivist for the Library of Congress's Moving Image Library, which has about 7,000 games, there are a lot of gaps in the collection, including the entire 1980s and most of the 90s. These games are probably just gone. Nobody will ever get to enjoy them or be inspired by them again. It's bleak. Like I said at the beginning, there's no objective reason why preservation is important. It's difficult, it's time-consuming, it's expensive, and even if it's done right, it's completely ephemeral. But you could say that about most things that are great. It makes me really appreciate all the currently existing preservation efforts, from personal game collections to the large video game libraries that are out there. Like the University of Michigan's Computer and Video Game Archive, which has over 10,000 games, all of which are available to be played by students and faculty, as well as approved non-students and faculty. And you can help. If you have some cool classic game, or equipment, or strategy guide, or anything else gamery, and if you're feeling generous, consider donating to an archive. Video games are awesome, and I don't care how lame that is to say. The video game industry is a titan. Gaming has become as mainstream as can be, and its global cultural footprint is undeniable. And it's such a collaborative medium, with so many moving cogs that need to be cooperating if they want to get the best work out of each other. It's important to acknowledge the creativity that goes into video game production, and the artistry inherent, not just in the game's visuals and soundtrack and acting, but also to the programming and gameplay. The way that gaming can make rhythmic finger movements feel so energizing. And regardless of the history that we've already lost, gaming is in its infancy. It's not too late. It'll be difficult and resource-intensive, but I like to imagine a future 100 generations from now where our descendants can look up at their vast video game libraries and thank us for allowing them to appreciate the genesis of an art form. Or maybe preservation just means that some kid way then might get to enjoy the same games that brought me joy when I was young, and that's a pretty good outcome too.